It begins with the sound of breath, trembling, uneven, almost human, almost prayer. A candle sputters, the flame bending toward a draft that should not exist in a sealed chapel. Wax drips onto the floorboards like tears. The air smells of iron, sweat, and the faint sweetness of magnolia gone to rot. They say you can still hear her if you stand outside Rosewood Chapel after midnight. Not words, just the sound of breath struggling against silence. A heartbeat that isn't your own. Where are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? Because when the clocks strike the same hour that it struck that night, November 14th, 1858, something in this story begins to stir again. The Colonel's wager was not made in jest. It was made in blood, bourbon, and pride, the three currencies of the Old South. The kind of pride that rots a man's soul until cruelty feels like duty and horror feels like proof of power. Augustus Fairmont, master of Rosewood Hall, had gambled everything except his daughter, until the night he decided she too could be wagered. Inside the chapel, Elizabeth Fairmont stood barefoot on cold stone, her gown simple, her belly curved with life. The four men stood apart, uncertain, bound by obedience and by the invisible chains that had ruled their entire existence. They had been told what this night was meant to be: degradation disguised as entertainment, humiliation made spectacle. But Elizabeth's eyes told another story. There was something alive behind them. Not fear, not despair. Something calculating. Something dangerous. Do not speak, she whispered to them. They are listening. Give them what they expect to hear. A single sound escaped her lips, a muffled cry that echoed through the door. Outside, the men drinking by lamplight exchanged glances and smirked. Draper raised his glass, satisfied. The bet was in motion. Inside, Elizabeth's voice turned sharp, commanding, almost priestly. Now, she said, the moment they believe begins the moment they stop watching. Every whisper from here must mean something. Every movement must count. The candlelight flickered over faces carved from years of endurance. Samuel, the carpenter. Joshua, the blacksmith. Marcus, the stableman. Isaac, the preacher. Each bore scars that told stories no history book would ever preserve. Elizabeth reached into her sleeve and produced a folded paper sealed with red wax. When the time comes, she said, this will be the weapon. Not a knife, not fire, truth. The men looked at one another, uncertain whether the white woman before them was mad or an angel. But in her voice they heard something they had not heard in years: conviction. Outside, Fairmont poured another glass. His hands were steady now. He believed he had won. Draper's laughter carried down the hallway, cruel, knowing. The witnesses drank to the ruin of one man and the entertainment of others. But above the noise, a storm gathered beyond the chapel walls. Wind pressed against the shutters. The sky blackened. The Mississippi groaned beneath the weight of its own current. Nature itself seemed to recoil from what was about to occur. Inside, Elizabeth stepped closer to Isaac. They think you are tools, she said softly. But tonight, you are the architects of their undoing. He frowned, whispering, you mean to defy them? I mean, she said, to end them. A silence thicker than death fell. The four men, enslaved by law and fear, felt the impossible pulse of rebellion take root. Not the kind of rebellion fought with rifles or fire, but with deception. With a plan designed to collapse an empire of lies from within. Outside, the colonel checked his pocket watch. An hour, he said. Let them have their hour. Inside, Elizabeth extinguished one of the candles. When the fourth flame dies, she murmured, the world changes. Her hand trembled slightly. She looked down at her belly, the child kicking faintly, and whispered to it, you will not be born in shame. From the shadows, Joshua asked, what do you intend to do when dawn comes? Elizabeth smiled faintly. her face pale and beautiful in the dying light. "If dawn comes," she said, "none of them will ever look at daylight the same way again." A clock struck somewhere far off. 1, 2, 3. The sound seemed to echo through the bones of the chapel, through time itself. Outside, Draper leaned back in his chair. "You think she'll survive it?" he asked, amused. Fairmont's eyes were glassy with drink. "She's strong," he muttered. "Like her mother," Draper grinned. "Then may she prove it." And as laughter filled the air, the fourth candle flickered. Inside the chapel, Elizabeth pressed the sealed letter into Samuel's palm. "Whatever happens," she said, "you must protect this. If I fail, bury it beneath the chapel floor. Someday someone will find it." He looked at her with solemn eyes. "And if you succeed?" "Then God help us all," she whispered. Lightning struck outside. The walls trembled. The door rattled in its frame. The witnesses sobered slightly, uneasy. For a moment, Draper glanced toward the darkened chapel and muttered, "Storm's picking up." But it wasn't the storm that worried them. It was the silence, because inside that chapel, something ancient was waking. Something older than their cruelty, older than their God, older even than the land itself. It had been waiting for centuries, buried beneath their rituals of power and ownership. And tonight, summoned by blood, fear, and defiance, it stirred. Have you ever wondered what it feels like when evil realizes it's being hunted? When the predator becomes prey? Comment your thoughts. I want to know what you think. The storm howled, and one by one the candles began to die. When the last flame vanished, the chapel door shuddered, and the screaming began. The first scream was not hers. It came from deep within one of the men, a sound torn from the soul rather than the throat. Outside, Draper leaned forward, smiling. "There it is," he said softly, the sound of the wager being fulfilled. But the colonel didn't smile. He stared at the locked door, the muscles in his jaw twitching, the bourbon sour in his mouth. He couldn't tell if it was pride or shame rising in his chest. Inside, the chapel shifted. The air thickened, pressing against their lungs. The four men stood motionless, eyes wide, as Elizabeth whispered in the darkness. "They must believe," she said, "until the storm covers everything." The shutters rattled violently. The candles had burned out, but lightning flickered through the stained glass, throwing shards of crimson and gold across the walls. In one blinding flash, the crucifix above the altar gleamed wet, as if sweating blood. Elizabeth moved like someone half-possessed. Her eyes glimmered, wild and bright. "It begins," she murmured. "The reckoning begins." She drew a knife from her dress, the one Clara had hidden for her, and cut her own palm. The men recoiled. Blood streamed down her wrist, warm and dark. She pressed it against the stone floor, tracing a circle that shimmered faintly in the lightning's glare. "Isaac," she whispered, "say the words you speak when the enslaved gather in the clearing, the ones they don't understand." He hesitated, trembling. "Those are prayers," he said. "Then pray," she replied, "but pray for the end of this curse." He began to speak, voice low and rhythmic, in the old tongue that had survived ships, chains, and centuries. The words throbbed like drum beats. The chapel seemed to breathe with him, each syllable echoing, folding back into itself, until even the walls felt alive. Elizabeth's blood glowed faintly against the stone. Her eyes fluttered shut. Samuel gripped his hands together, whispering a psalm under his breath, trying to hold on to something sane. Outside, Draper frowned. The sound had changed. It was no longer screaming, and it was chanting. Slow, heavy, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. "What in God's name?" he began. Fairmont rose unsteadily. "She's praying," he muttered. "That's all." But Draper wasn't convinced. He leaned closer to the door. The sound on the other side made his skin crawl. Inside, the circle pulsed brighter. Elizabeth's face was streaked with sweat. Her lips moved in time with Isaac's prayer. Her voice joined his, English and the old tongue weaving together like two serpents coiling around a single thought. Joshua's heart pounded. He looked to Samuel, who stared transfixed. "What is she doing?" Joshua whispered. Samuel's voice was hoarse. "She's binding something," he said, "or unbinding." The air grew hotter, pressing down on them. The scent of iron thickened. Elizabeth's eyes snapped open. "They built this chapel on stolen bones," she said. "Do you know that? They called it consecrated ground, but it was never holy. It was desecrated the moment it was built." The thunder cracked, shaking dust from the rafters. She turned toward the men. "Your ancestors lie beneath these stones. Their blood remembers. Tonight it answers." Lightning struck again, illuminating their faces, wide-eyed, terrified, unbelieving. And yet, in that moment, none of them moved to stop her. Because what if she was right? Outside, the witnesses exchanged uneasy looks. The storm was worsening. One of them, Sutherland, rose and muttered, "This is unnatural." Draper glared at him. "Sit down. The man owes me a fortune. We'll see it through." But even as he spoke, a strange humming filled the air. The door began to vibrate, as though something enormous pressed against it from within. Then silence. Inside, the circle glowed faintly red. Elizabeth stood in its center, blood dripping from her hand, eyes fixed on the crucifix. The wind died. "Now," she whispered. "They are listening again. They think the storm has broken. We have minutes before they return." Samuel stepped forward, his voice trembling. "What have you done?" Elizabeth looked down at her bleeding palm. "I have called for witnesses of my own," she said softly. "If they can summon evil for sport, then I can summon justice for truth." The baby kicked violently inside her. She winced but did not falter. "Listen to me," she said to the four men. "When the door opens, act as if nothing happened. They must believe their illusion. But once the colonel leaves, once the witnesses disperse, you take this letter and bury it beneath the altar." "Swear it." "We swear," Isaac said. Outside, Fairmont's voice came muffled through the wood. "Elizabeth, it is time." She froze, then turned to the men, eyes blazing. "Remember what you've seen here, because if I do not survive the dawn, you must make the world remember for me." The bolt turned. The door creaked open. The men inside straightened, their faces masks of submission. Elizabeth turned her head slightly toward the light spilling in. Draper's silhouette filled the doorway, a smile twisting his lips. "Well," he said, "the hour is over. Let's see what kind of daughter the colonel breeds." Elizabeth lifted her chin. Her voice was steady. "You will see nothing you understand." He frowned, and in that heartbeat lightning flashed again. Behind her the circle burned bright crimson. The witnesses gasped. Draper staggered backward, hand to his chest. "What is that?" But before anyone could answer, the crucifix above the altar split with a sound like tearing wood, and from within it came a scream that did not belong to any living thing. Fairmont fell to his knees. Draper shouted, Get out! Get out! And the wind returned, howling, violent, tearing through the hall like a beast unchained. What do you think Elizabeth called that night? Vengeance, madness, or something older than both? Comment your thoughts. I want to know what you think. Outside, lightning illuminated the colonel's face, twisted with terror as the chapel door slammed shut again on its own. Inside, the four men stood frozen in the red glow. Elizabeth's eyes turned toward the altar, and in the thunder's roar came a whisper that no one but her seemed to hear. You opened the door. Now you must finish it. The storm raged until the clock stopped. The wind screamed against the chapel's walls like something alive, something desperate to be heard. When it ended, there was no calm, only the kind of silence that feels like waiting. The witnesses had fled. Draper's carriage vanished into the blackness. Fairmont stood alone outside, soaked and trembling, staring at the locked door as if it had grown eyes. Inside, Elizabeth knelt in the center of the circle. Her hair clung to her skin, her face pale as wax, her hand still bleeding. The four men stood around her, silent, afraid to speak, afraid to move. The candles were gone, but a faint light, soft, gold, unnatural, seeped from the cracks between the stones, pulsing with every heartbeat in the room. Elizabeth lifted her head. "It's not over," she said softly. "It hasn't even begun," Isaac crossed himself. "You've woken something that should have slept." "I didn't wake it," she replied. "I just told it the truth." Her voice shook, but her eyes were steady, eyes that seemed to see beyond walls, beyond time. Joshua moved closer, whispering, "Miss Elizabeth, what did you call?" She looked up at him. "Justice, or something that remembers what justice used to be." The wind pressed against the windows again, gentle now, almost tender, like the sigh of a long-forgotten mother. Samuel knelt beside her. "The men outside, they're gone," she said. "But the ones beneath us, they're listening." The others glanced at the floor. Beneath the chapel, beneath the foundation stones, lay the buried remains of those who had died building it, the enslaved, unmarked, unnamed. It was said the soil never stopped bleeding. Elizabeth pressed her palm to the stone again, smearing blood across it like paint. "You built your heaven on their bones, Father," she whispered. "Now they'll have their say." Outside, Fairmont staggered to the door, pounding on it with both fists. "Elizabeth, open this instant." Her head turned toward the sound, slow and deliberate. "He's afraid," she murmured. "Good, he should be." Then, to the four men, "When he enters, you say nothing. Do nothing. Let him see what he's built." The lock turned with a violent snap. The door burst open. Fairmont stumbled in, rain-soaked and wide-eyed, his face pale beneath his silver hair. He looked from his daughter to the men surrounding her to the blood-stained floor. What have you done?" Elizabeth rose slowly, her dress clinging to her, her eyes dark with something he didn't recognize. "You made a wager," she said. "I fulfilled it. Where's Draper?" "Gone," she said. "He saw what you refused to see." Fairmont's voice cracked. "You've damned us all." "No," Elizabeth said, taking a step forward. "You damned us long before tonight. I just turned the mirror toward you." He reached for her but stopped halfway, staring at the floor. The faint glow between the stones had changed. No longer gold, but deep, pulsing red. It was spreading, crawling toward his boots. "What is this?" he whispered. "Debt," she said. "All debts come due, Father." The chapel groaned. The crucifix behind her swayed slightly, as though breathing. A drop of something thick fell from the carved Christ's hands. Not rain, not wax. The colonel stumbled backward, crossing himself. "God have mercy, he won't," Elizabeth interrupted. "You spent mercy like coin." He stared at her, horror dawning too late. "You don't understand what you've called down." "Oh," she said quietly. I understand perfectly. The light grew brighter, throbbing with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. The child in her womb kicked hard enough to make her gasp. Your bloodline, she whispered. You built it on ownership, on lies, on screams buried under hymns. Tonight it ends with me. Samuel took a cautious step back. Miss Elizabeth, go, she said sharply. Take your families and go. Follow the river north. Don't look back, but do as I say, she hissed. This house belongs to ghosts now. Isaac hesitated, then bowed his head. May the Lord guard you, she almost smiled. He's not the one guarding me. They fled into the storm. 4 men running through rain and thunder, carrying the sealed letter pressed against Samuel's chest. Behind them, lightning illuminated Rosewood Hall. Tall, elegant, monstrous. A house built on bones. Inside, Fairmont clutched his chest, breathing hard. You'll destroy everything, he gasped. Elizabeth looked up at the crucifix. Maybe that's the point. Then softly she began to hum. A lullaby, the same one her mother had sung before the fever took her. Her voice trembled but did not break. Fairmont's hand dropped from his chest. His eyes rolled white. And when he fell, he did not hit the floor. Something unseen caught him, held him, and drew him slowly toward the altar. Elizabeth turned away. He chose this. The baby inside her moved again, restless, almost aware. She whispered to it, You're not cursed. You're what comes after the curse. Outside, the storm began to calm. But within the chapel, time seemed to bend. The red glow flickered, then dimmed, leaving only the faint scent of burnt air and roses. Fairmont's body was gone. Only his pocket watch remained, ticking faintly on the altar. Elizabeth stared at it for a long time, then whispered, Now it begins. She turned toward the door, stepped outside, and the air was still. The rain had stopped. From the trees came a whisper, thousands of voices blending into one. Remember us. Have you ever wondered if places remember what was done to them? If the land itself keeps score, comment your thoughts. I want to know what you think. Elizabeth walked back toward Rosewood Hall, unaware that the eyes watching her from the shadows were no longer human. And somewhere behind her, the chapel door closed on its own. The morning after the storm, Rosewood Hall lay shrouded in mist. The air smelled of damp wood, ashes, and something faintly metallic. A trace of blood the rain hadn't washed away. The overseers whispered that lightning had struck the chapel, though no burn marks could be found. By sunrise, the colonel was missing. The witnesses had vanished into the swamp roads, and the men who'd been seen entering the chapel the night before were nowhere to be found. Elizabeth returned to the house at dawn. Her gown was torn, her skin pale as bone, but her step was steady. The servants froze where they stood, afraid to meet her eyes. She said nothing, only climbed the staircase with slow, deliberate grace, the hem of her dress trailing water and red dust. Constance Fairmont met her at the top of the stairs, eyes swollen from sleeplessness. "Where is he?" she whispered. Elizabeth brushed past her. "Gone? Gone?" "Yes." Constance grasped her wrist. "Do you know what you've done?" "The magistrate will—" "There will be no magistrate," Elizabeth said quietly. "No one will speak of this." Constance stared at her, trembling. "Do you think you can bury what happened?" Elizabeth turned her head, her eyes cold. "We've been burying things for generations. I'm just better at it." Downstairs, the grandfather clock struck 8, but its pendulum moved too slowly, as if the air itself resisted time. Outside, mist rolled across the fields, blurring the horizon until land and sky merged into one grey void. Clara found her mistress seated at the dining table, staring at an untouched plate of bread. "Miss Elizabeth," she whispered, "the chapel doors won't open. The men say it's sealed." Elizabeth didn't look up. "Good," Clara hesitated. "And the 4? The men, They're gone, Elizabeth interrupted. They've gone where the wind told them to go. Clara clasped her hands. And your father? Elizabeth's voice was flat. He's gone too. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Elizabeth said, Clara burned my mother's letters, all of them, and moved the cradle to my room. The child will sleep near me now. That night Constance packed a trunk and left for New Orleans without a word. The next morning her carriage was found overturned near the riverbank. The horses alive, the driver unconscious, Constance gone. Only her rosary remained tangled in the reeds. Within a week, rumors spread through Natchez that Rosewood's master had fled a debt, that his daughter had gone mad, that something unnatural lingered on the grounds. Travelers began avoiding the road that passed the estate. They said the mist there never lifted, that whispers drifted from the chapel long after midnight. But those who had worked the land, those who knew its true weight, said something else. They said Rosewood had finally turned on its master, that the soil had remembered. Elizabeth's days blurred into one another. She moved through the house like a ghost in her own skin, speaking little, sleeping less. She read from her journal at the window each night, her hand trembling as she wrote. He thought the wager was about control, but control is the first illusion. The truth is, every cruelty binds the crueler tighter than the victim, and when the debt comes due, it comes in full. She closed the book and stared into the dark beyond the glass. Sometimes she thought she saw shapes moving between the trees. 4 shadows, where there should have been none. On the 7th night after the storm, she heard the chapel bell ring. Once, twice, 3 times. She froze. The rope had been cut days before. Clara burst into her room moments later, gasping, "Miss Elizabeth, someone's in the chapel." Elizabeth rose, her face pale but composed. "Then it's time." She took the candle from her nightstand and walked barefoot through the corridor. The boards creaked beneath her, groaning like something old and dying. As she stepped outside, the air turned colder. The mist parted for her as she passed. The chapel door, once sealed, now stood ajar. The candle's light flickered against the wet stone. Inside, the pews were overturned. The altar dripped with moisture, though no rain had fallen. And in the center of the room, her father's pocket watch lay open, its hands spinning backward. Elizabeth bent down, picked it up and whispered, "I told you, Father. All debts come due." The candle went out. When it relit on its own, 4 figures stood in the shadows, Samuel, Joshua, Marcus, and Isaac. Yet their faces were wrong. Too still, too calm. Their eyes gleamed with something not of this world. "You left," she whispered. Isaac shook his head slowly. "We were sent away, but not to freedom." Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. "What do you mean?" Samuel stepped forward, his voice echoing unnaturally. "You called justice," it answered. "But justice doesn't free, it balances." A drop of water fell from the ceiling, striking the floor like a heartbeat. Elizabeth's candle flickered again. "Then what are you now?" "Witnesses," Isaac said. "And reminders." Elizabeth's lips trembled. "Of what?" Joshua's voice was low, almost gentle. "That no sin stays buried forever." The light dimmed until only their silhouettes remained, 4 dark shapes standing around her, unmoving. She took a step back. "What do you want from me?" They spoke together, one voice woven from 4 throats. "The truth. All of it. Before the child is born." Elizabeth clutched her stomach. "You think I haven't paid enough?" The whisper that followed wasn't human. "No one ever pays enough." The candle burst, scattering wax across the stone. In the darkness, Elizabeth fell to her knees, sobbing. "Then what do I do?" she whispered. The answer came from everywhere and nowhere. "Tell it. Make them remember. Have you ever wondered what it costs to tell the truth when the truth itself wants to be heard?" Comment your thoughts. I want to know what you think. Elizabeth lifted her head. The candle flame rekindled pale blue, and in its glow her reflection in the cracked glass of the altar was not alone. Another face, and faint, hollow-eyed, ancient, stared back. By the time the moon rose again, the house had begun to breathe. The walls pulsed faintly, as though something deep inside them had found rhythm. The portraits of ancestors, stern men and hollow-eyed women, seemed to watch Elizabeth as she walked the halls, their painted gazes shimmering when the candlelight passed. Every mirror in Rosewood was covered now. Every clock stopped. She spent the night in her mother's old chamber. On the dresser lay a bundle of letters bound with black silk. Letters she had ordered burned, yet here they were, untouched. Her hands shook as she untied them. The ink had bled, but one line stood clear on every page. The child carries both curse and cure. Outside, the chapel bell tolled again, though the rope was long gone. 3 times, then silence. Then once more, a softer, slower tone, as if wrung by a hand made of bone. Elizabeth's candle guttered. "Enough," she whispered to the empty room. "Show yourself." The air thickened. The curtains swayed, though no wind entered. In the mirror's shrouded shape, a faint outline began to form. A woman's figure, tall and thin, face veiled in shadow. Her voice was the sound of breath drawn through old paper. "You called," it said. Elizabeth's throat went dry. "Who are you?" "The first debt," the voice replied. "The mother before mothers. The one who was not buried properly." Elizabeth stepped back. "You mean—" "The soil remembers my name," the spirit murmured. "It remembers every cry that went unheard beneath your family's hymns." Elizabeth's voice trembled. "I tried to make it right. The veil shifted." Beneath it, faint eyes glowed. "No one makes it right. They only continue it or end it. Which will you do?" "I don't know anymore." "Then your child will decide for you." Elizabeth clutched her stomach. "This isn't its burden. It is now. The blood remembers." The candlelight flared, revealing the faint markings on the walls. Symbols carved beneath the plaster, circles within circles, older than any church. Her father had built the house over them, a foundation of prayers, stolen from those who never prayed to his God. The specter's voice deepened. "Your father sealed his covenant in my earth, and when he tried to buy favor, he offered you." Elizabeth's breath caught. He made me part of the pact. His firstborn of flesh for his firstborn of power. But you refused the exchange." She staggered. "So the ritual that night, it wasn't mine to begin with." "It was always yours," the spirit said. "He wrote the words, but you spoke them. The bond listens to the speaker." Lightning flashed outside, painting the room in silver light. Elizabeth saw her reflection for the first time in days, her eyes no longer her own. A faint red shimmer coiled within them, like embers waiting for air. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. "To finish what was begun, to end the lineage of debt, to give the land back to itself. And if I refuse?" The answer came with a soft, wet sound from beneath the floorboards, a slow, dragging shift, as if something enormous was turning in the soil below. "Then it will wake," the spirit said. "And it will feed on every name still bound to yours." Elizabeth fell to her knees. The ground beneath her was warm now, too warm, like breath exhaling through stone. She felt it move, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. Tears burned her eyes. "Tell me how to stop it." The spirit raised one pale hand. "When the sun dies on the 3rd night, bring the child to the chapel. Lay him upon the altar and speak the names that were stolen. Only then will the earth sleep again." Elizabeth's voice cracked. "And if I don't?" "Then Rosewood will become the mouth of what you called justice." The figure began to fade, leaving behind the faint scent of myrrh and rot. Elizabeth whispered, "Who are you, really?" The answer came from the dark. "Your mother's sin." The candle went out. Outside, dogs began to howl. The house groaned as if it were stretching, shaking off its age. Elizabeth ran to the balcony. The mist had turned crimson under the moonlight. From the chapel roof, she saw something impossible. Roots bursting through the stone, winding upward like veins toward heaven. The bell rang again. One final time, and with each toll, the ground seemed to sink a little deeper. She clutched the railing, whispering to herself, 3 nights. I have 3 nights. Then she heard it, soft footsteps behind her, too light to be Clara's, too small to belong to any grown thing. She turned. In the doorway stood a boy no older than 6, barefoot, drenched, and staring. His eyes were all black. He smiled. You called me, Mama. Elizabeth's scream was swallowed by the night. Have you ever wondered what would answer if you called something older than God, and it decided to love you back? Comment your thoughts. I want to know what you think. The boy didn't vanish when morning came. He sat at the edge of Elizabeth's bed, silent, watching her with eyes that reflected nothing. His skin was pale, but not humanly so, translucent, like wax left too close to a flame. When she reached out to touch him, her hand passed through cold air that felt thick, almost liquid. He tilted his head. You don't remember me, he said. Elizabeth's breath trembled. You're not real, he smiled faintly. You made me real. She stumbled back, clutching her chest. What are you? He looked toward the window. Something your father owed and your blood kept. Outside, the mist had not lifted. It rolled low over the earth, blurring fences and fields, swallowing light whole. The workers had fled. The stables stood empty. Only the chapel bell still moved, ringing softly without wind. Clara found Elizabeth hours later, kneeling before the hearth, whispering to the flames. Miss Elizabeth, you haven't eaten. Elizabeth turned slowly. He's awake. Clara froze. Who, miss? The child. Clara looked toward the bed and gasped. The boy sat where the light couldn't reach, hands folded neatly in his lap. But in that darkness his outline flickered like a lantern beneath water. Clara crossed herself. Mercy, Lord. Elizabeth rose, her voice calm but distant. No mercy left here, Clara. Only promises. The boy stood, stepping forward. His feet left faint red marks on the floor like rust blooming from wood. She's right, he said. You can't pray what's owed away. Clara backed toward the door. What is that thing? Elizabeth whispered. Mine. That night, she wrote again in her journal. The ink bled through the paper, the words nearly illegible. He looks like the child I might have had, the one I buried before birth. But he speaks with my father's tongue, and there is knowledge in his silence that no living child should possess. I feel the walls shifting when he laughs. I feel the earth breathing when he sleeps. I fear I've become the vessel of something that remembers too much. She closed the book and looked up. The boy was standing in the doorway again, holding her father's pocket watch. Its hands spun faster now, ticking without sound. What do you want? She asked. He tilted his head. To finish your prayer. I never prayed. You did, he said, smiling. When you said let them remember, that was a prayer, and I am the remembering. She felt her knees weaken. You're not supposed to be here. He took another step closer. Neither are you. The words struck her like a chill. What do you mean? You died in the chapel, he said softly. When the light went red, you just haven't realized it yet. The candle flickered violently, guttered, and then burned twice as bright. Elizabeth whispered, No, I walked out. I remember. You remember the version you needed to. Something stirred in the walls again, slow, rhythmic, like a great heart beating within the house. The boy continued, The earth took him first, then you, but it let you keep walking because you had to tell the story. That was the bargain. Elizabeth clutched the table to keep from falling. This isn't real. It's more real than you ever were. A gust of wind burst through the room, scattering her papers. From outside came the low hum of voices, dozens, maybe hundreds, chanting in a language older than the house itself. The boy looked toward the window. "They're waiting for you, Mama." She followed his gaze. Through the fog, she saw them, figures rising from the earth, drenched in mud and moonlight. Men and women, old and young, their faces half-formed, their mouths open as if still screaming. Elizabeth whispered, "The ones buried beneath." The boy nodded. "You woke them. Now they need a voice." Tears filled her eyes. I don't know what to say." "They'll teach you." He reached out his hand. She hesitated, then took it. His fingers were colder than stone. The moment their skin met, the world tilted. The room stretched and shivered, walls bending like wet cloth. The portraits of her ancestors began to burn, slowly, without smoke. The air filled with whispers, some pleading, some laughing, some weeping. Elizabeth screamed. "Stop, please!" The boy leaned close, his voice like wind through a grave. "You said you wanted justice. This is what it sounds like." The whispers grew louder, merging into a single chant. Elizabeth clutched her head, falling to her knees. The floor beneath her turned black, slick, alive. From the wood rose hands, thin, skeletal, reaching toward her face, her throat, her belly. She gasped, clawing at them. "What do you want from me?" The voices answered together, "To be remembered by name." The boy looked down at her, eyes full of something like pity. "Say them, Mama, before the sun dies." "I don't know their names," she cried. He touched her forehead. "Then remember them in pain." The moment he said it, 1,000 memories flooded her, faces she had never seen, screams she had never heard, lives crushed under her family's weight. She saw chains, fires, whips, and hymns sung over open graves. She saw her father smile when he said the land was his. She saw herself as a child, playing in a garden watered with the tears of the forgotten. And then, silence. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer in her room. She stood in the chapel again, barefoot, candlelight flickering on wet stone. The altar glowed faintly red. The boy stood before it, waiting. 3 nights, he said, and the third ends at dawn. She looked toward the window. The first hint of light had begun to rise. Elizabeth whispered, "Then I don't have much time left." He smiled. "No one ever does." Have you ever wondered what it means when the dead start asking to be remembered by name, and you realize one of the names is yours? Comment your thoughts. I want to know what you think. The air that morning carried no birdsong, only the heavy hum of something vast beneath the soil. Elizabeth stood barefoot in the dew, her nightgown clinging to her skin. The fog parted only enough to reveal the chapel, its door ajar though no wind stirred. The boy stood within the threshold, waiting. That same faint smile fixed upon his lips like a wound that never healed. Inside, the candles burned black. Their flames gave no warmth, only motion, slow spirals that bent away from her as if repelled. The altar dripped with something dark and glistening, and when Elizabeth reached out, she realized it wasn't wax. It was blood, old blood. Centuries old. The boy watched her quietly. "You think this house began with your father?" he said. "But he only built on top of what was already buried." "Buried?" she asked, her voice thin. He nodded toward the floor. "There were others before. People who sang to the river, who called fire by name. They were here long before your kind came with iron and scripture. But your family dug their graves and built a chapel over their bones. The stone remembers." "So do I." Elizabeth's breath caught. "What are you asking me to do?" "Finish what they started," he said. "Free what your father bound." She shook her head. "I don't know how." "You will," he whispered. "At the third dawn." He turned and walked deeper into the chapel. Elizabeth followed, each step sinking into something soft beneath the floorboards. She looked down and froze. The boards weren't wood. They were ribs. Human ribs, packed tightly together, polished smooth by the passage of countless feet. She fell to her knees, retching. The boy crouched beside her, his expression tender. "You were never meant to walk on holy ground. You were meant to become it. Stop," she gasped. "Please stop." But the chapel was changing. The walls began to pulse with slow, wet rhythm, as though breathing. Symbols appeared in the candle soot, loops, spirals, eyes. Each one shimmered faintly, alive. The air filled with whispers again, but now they weren't pleading, they were calling. Elizabeth. Elizabeth Fairmont. She covered her ears, shaking her head. "No, don't speak my name." The boy's voice was soft. "Names bind, Mama. You gave them yours. Now they'll give you theirs." And then she saw them. The 4 men. Samuel, Joshua, Marcus, and Isaac. They stood in the back of the chapel, their forms translucent, their faces hollow with grief and fury. They were not alive, and yet they were not gone. "Elizabeth," Samuel said. His voice echoed like a hammer striking stone. "We kept our promise." Her tears blurred her vision. "You're alive." "No," Joshua interrupted. "You killed us when you lit the candle." She shook her head violently. "I didn't." Isaac raised his hand. "You called for justice, and justice never comes clean." The boy stepped between them. "She is the key," he said. "Her blood opens the door." The ghosts looked at him, then at Elizabeth. Marcus spoke, his tone quiet but sharp. "Then let her bleed." The candles flared. Elizabeth screamed, "No, please, I didn't mean for this." "You wanted them to pay," Samuel said. "Your father, Draper, all of them. So did we. But you didn't understand the cost." He reached toward her, and his hand passed through her chest. A searing pain tore through her, cold fire spreading through her heart. Her vision blurred, and in that agony, she saw it all. The Magnolia Club's secret rites, the rituals they mocked as wagers, the women taken to the chapel before her, the earth itself fed with their blood, every debt sealed in flesh, every lie written in bone. When she could breathe again, she fell to her knees. "Then help me end it," she whispered. "Please, help me." The 4 spirits looked to one another. Finally, Isaac nodded. "There is one way, the same way it began." Elizabeth swallowed hard. "Tell me." "The fire beneath the chapel still burns," he said. "The one they lit when they consecrated the ground. It's not wood or coal, it's life. If you can reach it, and offer it what it's owed, it will unmake this place." "What is it owed?" she asked, though she already knew. The boy smiled faintly. "Blood for blood." Her stomach twisted. "Mine," he nodded. "Yours, and the one inside you." Elizabeth stared at him in horror. "No, I won't." "Then the land keeps what it has," he said simply. "And your father's sins will grow forever." Outside, thunder rumbled though the sky was clear. The fog pulsed with red light. The earth trembled beneath her feet, whispering in voices too old to understand. Clara burst into the chapel, screaming, "Miss Elizabeth! The ground's opening! The graves, God help us, the graves are opening!" Elizabeth turned. Through the doorway, she saw shapes rising from the soil. Bodies unspoiled by time, eyes shining with the same dull red as the candles. The boy looked at her calmly. "The third dawn comes sooner than you think." Elizabeth stepped back, clutching her stomach, her eyes wild. "I can't kill my child. You already did," the boy said gently. "Now you just need to remember it." The chapel door slammed shut. The candles went out one by one, plunging them into silence. Then, from somewhere deep below the floor, came the sound of a heartbeat, slow, enormous, ancient. It echoed once, twice, then stopped, and in the darkness, the boy whispered, "He's awake." The ground split open. "Tell me, if you were standing there, knowing that one act of sacrifice could cleanse a century of evil, but the price was your own blood, would you do it, or would you let the world burn? Comment your answer below. I want to know what you think. The ground split in silence first, not a roar, not an earthquake, but a soft parting sound, like wet cloth being torn. Then came the light. It rose from beneath the chapel floor, deep red and trembling, casting the walls in a living glow that moved like veins. The air turned thick with heat and iron. Clara screamed and ran toward Elizabeth, but the boy raised a hand. The door sealed shut, melting into the wall as if the wood itself had chosen to obey him. "Don't," he said softly. "She doesn't belong in this part of the story." Clara banged on the invisible barrier, her cries muffled. "Miss Elizabeth, you come out right now, you hear me?" But Elizabeth couldn't move. The chapel pulsed around her, alive, breathing, aware. Beneath her feet the ribbed floor cracked open, revealing a pit that glowed from within. Shapes moved in the molten light. Limbs, faces, pieces of things that once were human. The boy stepped to the edge, staring down. "They're waiting," he said. "They remember what your father promised." "What did he promise?" Elizabeth whispered, her voice trembling. "An offering," the boy said. "Every generation. A Fairmont to feed the fire. It's how the land stayed rich. How Rosewood thrived while others starved. He knew the price. They all did." Elizabeth felt her knees weaken. "No, he never—" The boy's eyes flashed. "He did. The ledger in his study wasn't for gambling, Mama. It was scripture. The Magnolia men weren't betting for sport. They were binding souls to keep their power. You were always meant to be the next." Her breath caught. "Then why me? Why this child?" "Because you broke the cycle when you fought back," he said. "You refused to obey. You made them bleed before the altar. You ended their pact. But the land doesn't forget. The fire still hungers." The light grew brighter. The heat scalded her skin. She could smell her hair burning. "Please," she begged, "tell me what to do." The boy stepped closer, the glow reflecting in his hollow eyes. "You do what he did. You give it blood willingly. Then it sleeps." She looked down at her stomach, the place where life stirred weakly inside her. "It's innocent," she whispered. The boy tilted his head. So were they. The ghosts of Samuel, Joshua, Marcus, and Isaac appeared again, standing across the pit. Their forms flickered, their faces solemn. Isaac spoke first. "The sins of fathers stain generations. Yours can end it, Miss Elizabeth. But not without pain." Elizabeth shook her head violently. "No, I won't become what he was." Joshua's voice was a low thunder. "Then he wins. Every acre of this cursed soil stays bound in his name." The chapel trembled. The altar split, spilling fire like water. From the cracks rose shapes. Spectral bodies clawing their way upward, faces burned away but still screaming. They reached for her, not in hatred but in hunger. Elizabeth staggered back. "Get away!" The boy reached for her hand. "You asked for justice. Justice takes everything." She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time saw the truth behind his face. He was her son, the one she had lost before birth, the one whose life had been taken by her father's cruelty, when the beating left her bleeding in her chamber months before that night in the chapel. The child who never drew breath, her voice broke. You were mine." He nodded slowly. "And I am his. Both his sin and your sorrow." Tears blurred her vision. "Then what happens if I do this?" The boy's smile was heartbreak. "The land will forget him. It will forget all their names. Rosewood will fall to dust. And I'll sleep. You'll sleep too. And if I don't?" He turned toward the fire. "Then it spreads. Across every field, every home, every descendant who bears your name. Until there's nothing left to burn." The chapel groaned. The ribs beneath her feet cracked again. Flames licked higher, reaching for the rafters. Elizabeth fell to her knees, sobbing. "God forgive me." "No God left here," Isaac murmured. "Only choice." She rose, trembling, and looked one last time at Clara through the sealed doorway. The woman was praying, her face pressed against invisible glass. Elizabeth mouthed the words, "Thank you." Then she turned back to the pit. The boy held out his hand. "Say it," he whispered. "What?" The words your father said when he sealed the first pact. The same words that bound us. I don't know them. You do, he said gently. They're written in your blood. She closed her eyes. The words came unbidden. Not English, not any tongue she knew, but something older, guttural, aching. As she spoke, the fire flared white, and the ghosts bowed their heads. The boy stepped closer, pressed her hand to her stomach, and guided the blade she hadn't realized she was holding. Elizabeth gasped, a sharp, shocked breath. And then the world turned to light. The fire screamed. The chapel roof burst outward. For a moment, everything was gone. Then, silence. When Clara awoke hours later amid the ashes, there was no chapel. No bones, no altar. Only a blackened crater filled with rainwater and one object floating at its center, a child's pocket watch. Its hands finely still, and if you walked close enough, you could see faint words carved into the soot-black stone where the chapel had once stood. Let them remember by name. Tell me something. If you were Elizabeth, holding both the curse and its cure inside your own body, would you choose redemption or revenge? Comment below. I want to know which one you'd choose. The rain fell for 3 days without stopping. Cold, grey sheets that turned the fields into rivers and the woods into whispering caverns. By the 4th morning, the air stank of smoke and iron, though no fire burned. The people of Rosewood said it was the earth purging itself. Others whispered that something far older was trying to crawl back out. Clara didn't sleep. She stayed by the crater where the chapel once stood, wrapped in a torn shawl, her eyes fixed on the water below. Each night, the surface rippled though there was no wind. Sometimes she thought she saw shapes moving beneath. The faint curve of a face, a hand pressing up against the darkness. On the 7th night, the watch started ticking again. No one heard it but her. A faint metallic heartbeat echoing through the mud. When she picked it up, the hands spun backward faster and faster, until the glass shattered in her palm. Beneath it, where gears should have been, was a sliver of parchment folded so small it might have been mistaken for dust. She unwrapped it with trembling fingers. One sentence written in ink the color of dried blood. The Fairmont debt is not forgiven. Only delayed. Her breath caught. Behind her the woods shifted. Branches creaked. Birds fled in silence. And for a moment she thought she heard someone breathing right at her back. When she turned, the clearing was empty, but the smell of burning magnolia drifted through the rain. Clara packed what little she had and left Rosewood before dawn. She didn't look back once, yet 50 miles north, the fire still followed. At an inn on the edge of Willow Creek, she dreamt of Elizabeth. Not the woman she'd known, pale and trembling in her nightgown, but something changed. Elizabeth stood at the edge of the same black pit, the child beside her, both untouched by the flames. The boy was smiling again. "You can't leave it buried," he said. "It remembers its shape. It remembers your face." Clara tried to speak, but her voice didn't follow her into the dream. The air was thick, muffled. Only the sound of the ticking filled her ears, faster now, frantic, like something running out of time. Elizabeth turned toward her, eyes glowing faintly red. "You think the curse ends when one dies?" "No, Clara. It sleeps inside those who remember. And you remember too much." The dream shattered. Clara woke to find ash scattered across her blanket, not soot, not dirt, but fine grey dust that smelled faintly of blood and rose petals. Her hands were shaking. Outside her window, every candle in the street had gone out at once. The next morning, a letter waited on her table. No one had seen who left it. No seal, no address. Just her name in slanted handwriting she recognized instantly. Elizabeth's. Inside, another note. "If the land ever blooms again, don't trust it. What grows from ash is never clean." That night, Clara left the inn again. She followed the old railway north, walking until her feet bled. Every time she stopped to rest, she heard the same sound in the distance. The faint, rhythmic ticking of a watch, moving just behind her. When she reached the ruins of Fairmont Manor, she understood why. The estate was gone, nothing but pillars and vines. Yet the garden had come back. Magnolias bloomed where the fire had burned deepest, their petals unnaturally white, their roots growing out of bones. At the center stood a single figure, a woman in a dark dress, her back turned. Her hair, long and matted, dripped with rainwater. When she turned, Clara fell to her knees. It was Elizabeth, or what was left of her. Her face was cracked like porcelain, veins of red light glowing beneath the surface. The boy stood beside her, holding the watch, its hands now moving forward again. "I told you," Elizabeth said softly. "The land remembers. It keeps what it loves," Clara whispered. "What do you want from me?" Elizabeth tilted her head. "I want you to tell them. All of them. Every town, every family built on our ashes. I want the truth to live long enough to make them afraid again." The boy looked up. "Because fear keeps the fire warm." And then the magnolias began to bleed. Thick crimson sap dripped from their petals, pooling around Clara's feet. The air shimmered with heat, though no flame was visible. Elizabeth stepped closer, her voice now both gentle and inhuman. "Tell them the dead breathes. Tell them the next harvest is already promised." Clara screamed, not out of fear, but because she finally believed. When travelers passed through the ruins years later, they found only the vines and the watch, still ticking, buried in the roots. The magnolias never stopped blooming. They never wilted, and if you stood there long enough, you could still hear a woman's voice in the rain, whispering the same words over and over: "Not forgiven. Only delayed." They say time dies where blood was spilled with purpose. In Rosewood, the clocks began to prove it. No one noticed at first. A few stopped pocket watches. A church bell that never struck midnight again. Then the sun itself began to stall, rising too late, setting too soon, leaving the valley in an endless half-light that felt like holding your breath. By the time the first investigator arrived, half the town was gone. He was a young man from Atlanta, sent by the state to chart the land for development. His name was Thomas Hale, and he didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in paperwork, ink, and the smell of old iron bridges at dawn. But when he reached Rosewood, his compass spun in circles. The air made his teeth ache. The trees grew too close together, as though they were listening. He found the crater where the chapel had been, now a small lake. Its surface was perfectly still. Not even insects dared disturb it. But the moment he looked down, his reflection smiled before he did. He left that night, but something followed him. It began with the ticking. At first faint, a sound in the walls, in the floorboards inside his ears when the world went quiet. Then it moved into his dreams. He'd wake with his hand clenched around something cold, though his watch was always on the dresser. One evening, as he reviewed his notes, he saw it. A name written in the margins of his journal in a hand that wasn't his. Elizabeth Fairmont. He tried to tear the page out, but when he did, blood seeped from the paper. The words remained, etched into the fibers like scars. That night, the rain began to fall again. The same storm that had drowned the chapel years before. Hale ran to his window, and there, beneath the magnolia tree, stood a woman in black. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned faintly red, and the petals around her were slick with something that wasn't rain. She whispered his name, and he answered without meaning to. The next morning, his landlord found the house empty, the bed untouched. The clock on the wall still ticking, its hands fixed at 3:07 a.m. By spring, Rosewood was gone from every map. The rail lines that led there rusted overnight. Travelers swore the forest had swallowed the valley whole, leaving only silence where the town had once breathed. But when the wind blew east, you could still smell smoke. And Magnolia, years passed, generations moved on. But across the south, small things began to happen. Unmarked graves found beneath schoolhouses, fields that refused to grow no matter how many times they were plowed. Children born with the Fairmont mark, a faint burn scar shaped like a clock hand across the wrist. They would wake at night, eyes open but dreaming, whispering the same phrase in voices too old for their age. The debt remembers. Some called it a curse. Others called it justice. In the archives of a burned courthouse near Rosewood's ruins, a final record remained. Clara's handwriting, though faded and warped by heat. It was a letter never sent. If this reaches anyone who still walks the living earth, know this: the fire beneath our feet was never meant to warm us. It was meant to feed, and those who took comfort in its light must one day give it back. When the ticking starts, it means the door is open again. Close it if you can. Pray if you can't. No one knows what became of her. Some say she was last seen walking into the lake, carrying a lantern that burned blue instead of gold. Others claim they've seen her on the roadside at dusk, barefoot and smiling, whispering stories to travelers who never reach their next town. But one truth endures. Every 50 years, when the magnolias bloom red instead of white, the clocks in Rose County begin to tick backward again. And somewhere, beneath the soil that once bore the Fairmont name, a heartbeat begins to match their rhythm, slow, measured, patient, waiting for someone else to remember, because curses don't die. They sleep, and tonight you've just woken one. Now tell me, when the ticking begins in your house, will you listen?